Hello, good afternoon, and we're so glad you're going to join us for today's webinar. The webinar's name today is The Importance of Cultivating the Board's Understanding of Programs. We are really pleased. My name is Ruth McCambridge, and I'm really pleased to have with me today Ann Wallstad and Bernetta Walker of BoardSource. I'm going to say more about the two of them in a minute. But just as an intro, I do want to say that this is one of the more important topics that I think we could cover about boards. There's been a number of ways that we've approached, and we're going to go more into later kind of what is the importance of board members understanding the programmatic aspects of nonprofits and the mission really deeply. But one of the things that we may have done inadvertently over the years is actually to draw people a little off course in terms of the importance of this particular issue. So I want to say, early on that one of the things that we've done is that by trying to over professionalize our board or really concentrate on the professional skills and high level connections of our boards, we've kind of, we might give lip service to the idea that mission has to be absolutely primary, but we don't necessarily act that way. But I want to say that the research about this particular issue of the importance of programmatic understanding to boards is really pretty old, at least 20 years old, more than that, probably more like 30 years old. There's a lot of behavior that talks about the fact that when boards first start, when organizations first start, they very often, everybody in the whole organization will be intensely mission focused. They're very familiar with what it is, how the organization intends to go about pursuing its mission, and that means they understand what the programs are and what the rationale behind the programs are, and et cetera. But as time goes on and there becomes more emphasis on professionalizing, what tends to happen is that boards will take on some of the norms that consultants have been promoting for years, that really what you need is a butcher, a baker, a candlestick maker on your board. You essentially need an attorney, a human resource person, and any number of other professional types on your board. So boards will very often go out and recruit people that have never stepped foot inside of their agency, not even once, don't know anybody who makes use of the agency's services, and essentially will come on the board to help the organization out with their professional capacities. The research actually implies that what happens at that point is that the unity of the mission begins to wane away in terms of the board dynamic. And that you have people really dealing with individual kind of siloed activities, whether it's reviewing the HR policy or it's being on the development committee or whatever, that it becomes less of a kind of we're here to help these children who have this particular issue, and more about what's the development committee doing right now. Now, it's kind of important to have a both and, but the loss of kind of the unity of the real mission focus amongst everybody is a real problem in a lot of boards. So today we're going to talk about some of the more recent research that BoardSource has done, which I was just thrilled to see because it kind of reiterates this point and embellishes on it in a really important way. So I do want to say that, if people want to look at some of that old research, they can go back to 1992 and Miriam Wood, who wrote something on the cyclical nature of board behavior. And we don't necessarily believe that board behavior is always cyclical, but we do believe that some of the dynamics that she describes in there about the over-bureaucratization of the identity of the board is definitely a problem. So with that, this is part 3 of a 4-part webinar series, which provides an exclusive deep dive into Board Source's latest report, Leading with Intent. We're thrilled to present this series of 4 discussions on these important findings. It may sound obvious, but boards cannot lead effectively if they do not understand the organization's work. Leading with Intent shows just how important it is for boards to understand the mission and programs of their nonprofits. But when executives graded their own boards on this measure, whether or not the boards understood the programs, the average grade was a B. Board members' knowledge of programs correlates to stronger or weaker performance across several areas, including strategic thinking and planning, overall engagement and commitment, and external leadership and ambassadorship, including fundraising and advocacy. So there you go. That's what Vernetta and Ann are here to talk to you about today. So Ann Wallestad is BoardSource's CEO, and Vernetta Walker is BoardSource's Chief Governance Officer and Vice President of Programs. Don't forget that we will be having a fourth session, and so you should keep an eye out for that. It will happen on December 12th of this year, and we'll be sure to notify you when registration is available. The reason why this particular session is free to you is that we have a sponsorship by Board Effect. They are passionate about the work of boards, which guides how they develop the Board Effect solution. Board Effect's board management software drives efficiency, effectiveness, and engagement among directors, officers, and administrators. This webinar will be recorded for all of you who want to, make sure that maybe members of your board see it before their next recruitment process. But it will be recorded and will be sent to you shortly after the meeting. It'll also be freely available on our website. Those can be accessed really pretty much at any time. We will be leaving time for questions at the end. So as you are listening to Ann and Vernetta, make sure that at the time they're talking, you write your question down. Just, you can log it in the questions area that's on the right-hand side of your page. And just anytime. If they've already gone over the material at the end, I won't ask the question. I'll be the one that'll be kind of making my way through the questions with Ann and Vernetta. So don't worry if we've already answered it. We're not going to reiterate it. Finally, we have social media attached to this webinar. We think it's really important that you go and tweet to your friends and colleagues about this session so they'll know that they can actually make use of it. So any important points that you think have been made, anything that you feel is inspirational for people outside, go ahead and tweet it and let people know that this material is on our website. And now I'm going to pass it over to Ann and Vernetta, but I think Ann is going to take the lead, right?
That's right. Thank you so much, Ruth. We can go ahead and skip ahead to slide 3, because I want to start by just sharing a little bit about the study, Leading with Intent. And we're so pleased to partner with Nonprofit Correlate to share these findings. So as Ruth mentioned, this is our third of 4. And we're excited to have the opportunity to drill down on this question about the relationship between understanding of programs and performance in some other key areas of board responsibility. So Leading with Intent overall is a biennial study that BoardSource does focused on board composition, culture, and performance. We first started doing this study all the way back in 1994, though of course it has changed and grown and become more sophisticated since that first survey that we did. And I would be remiss if I did not say, even though we have more than 20 years of data from this study, it is not a longitudinal study. We're not looking at a stable sample over time. So while we can look at moments in time and reflect on how how things have changed or how the picture has shifted, it's not a stable sample that allows us to truly say this is how the sector as a whole has moved. And it's a convenient sample of executives and board chairs. For those of you who are interested in reading the full study, which I highly encourage you to do, it is available for free as a download at leadingwithintent.org. And I encourage you to take a look because we're only going to be covering one sliver of the findings today, and there is a lot more there. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So I want to share with you just a little bit about who responded to the survey, because obviously the findings are informed by who actually responded. We had close to 1,800 nonprofit leaders who responded to the Leading with Intent survey instrument. And as you see on the slide, that's about 1,400 chief executives or executive directors and about 400 board chairs or another board leader who was designated. I'm excited to share that we have close to 225 paired responses, meaning a response from both the board chair and the executive that will enable us to do some deeper analysis, which we're working on in 2018. For purposes of this conversation today, we're just looking at those in aggregate. So we're looking at all executives together and all board chairs or board designees together. And you can see there the breakout between public charities, foundations, and other types of nonprofits. Next slide. In terms of the structure of the study, we ask a whole host of questions of both executives and board chairs, which are really focused on helping us understand 4 aspects of boards. So first, the people. Who's serving on boards? What's that overall demographic composition of boards? What does it look like in terms of boards versus executives? So we really want to start by having a firm understanding of who really is at the helm of nonprofit organizations. Then we ask a whole series of questions related to the board's culture. What aspects of the culture are really strong, which aspects are a little bit weaker, and what relationships might there be to other aspects of the board's work. The next section is around the board's work. So how's the board performing on its basic roles and responsibilities, and looking at how executives and board chairs rate their performance in those key areas. And then finally, and this is new with the 2017 study, really taking a closer look at how the board and the executive perceive the board's impact on organizational performance. And so Leading with Intent 2017 takes a first step in really trying to understand, are there certain aspects of board behavior, board composition, board structure that are more related to higher impact or higher perception of impact on organizational performance. And you're going to see a little bit more about that in some subsequent slides. Moving ahead, in fact, right here we are. So there were 2 things that really came to the fore when we looked at the relationship between specific board characteristics and the perception of the board's impact on organizational performance. Those 2 things were, first, a strong understanding of the board's roles and responsibilities. It seems pretty straightforward and basic, but obviously to do a good job, you need to understand what that job is, and that's really what we see that finding illustrating. The second piece that ranked for both board chairs and executives was the extent to which the board is a collaborative team working towards shared goals. And it's these 2 things combined that seem to have a really positive impact or seem to be related to the organizations that report that their board has a positive impact on organizational performance. So Leading with Intent looks at both of those things a bit more closely and tries to understand why that might be and how that's actually playing out within boardrooms. Next slide. So as we think about those 2 characteristics of boards, we think that there's a really important dimension to that that's worth exploring further. And that really is, as Ruth teed up, the extent to which the board has strong knowledge and understanding of the organization's programs. And what we found was that there was a quite strong relationship with how well the board is doing in that area and the board's ability in 3 other key areas. So 1 is the ability to engage effectively in strategy, 2, overall commitment and engagement, and 3, fundraising and other forms of external leadership, including advocacy. there was a very strong relationship between boards that did well in terms of their knowledge of organizational programs and boards that did well in these three key areas. And that is not significant in terms of thinking about high leverage opportunities to really invest in board development and strengthen the board's overall impact, both in terms of the way that it functions and its positive impact on the organization. So I want to drill down on that a little bit, and we can go to the next slide, which looks specifically at that relationship between knowledge of programs and strategic thinking and planning. And I'm going to walk us through this because I know there's a lot of information on this slide. So across the top, you see the categorizations of boards that got different grades in terms of their knowledge of programs. And for purposes of this slide, we took out those that were in the C range, meaning the middle, because we thought it was most helpful to actually look at the ends. So in the left-hand column, you see boards that have the strongest knowledge of programs by receiving an A grade. And these are ratings by the executive. So we only looked at one there. The second column is strong knowledge of programs as characterized by an A or B grade. And then finally on the right is weak knowledge of programs with a D or an F grade. And what you see here and what we saw is a really interesting phenomena in terms of boards that do have the stronger knowledge of programs and are more highly rated in terms of their performance around thinking strategically as a board is the first section, and then appropriately balancing short-term and long-term needs. And then on the flip side, when boards are doing really not so well in their understanding of programs, really poor grades. And we thought that relationship was really, really striking and worth really highlighting because it is just so clear that there is such a strong relationship in terms of the board's ability to do these things. I'm going to go ahead and advance to the next slide, and it is laid out the same way, so I won't go through that again, but this is looking at engagement and commitment. So you can see a similar relationship when we're looking at how engaged in governing and overseeing the organization is the board, and what's their overall level of commitment and involvement. And you can see, just one example, folks boards that were graded with an A in programs, 91% of them strongly agree that the board is actively engaged in overseeing and governing the organization. When they get a D or an F, 65% disagree. So really, again, quite striking in terms of that relationship. Let's go ahead to the next slide, which is the final one that looks at the data in this particular way. And this is, I think, sort of the big news, I think, for a lot of organizations, given the focus on improving fundraising performance and improving community building and outreach. Both of these categories of the board's responsibilities have a very strong connection to understanding of programs. So you see a similar phenomena there, and it's particularly strong in the negative. So weak knowledge of programs with a D or an F, 69% get a D or an F in fundraising. 71% get a D or an F in community building and outreach. And while the data don't necessarily tell us why that is, it's reasonable to assume based on these findings, and I think we heard this, Ruth, in your commentary, of course you can't represent the organization effectively externally if you don't have a good understanding of programs. And also, if you don't have a good understanding of programs, you're probably much less likely to want to. And I think that's what we see in terms of that commitment and engagement. We can go ahead and go to the next slide, which really just shares some context about why this is so important. So when we look at all of the categories of board responsibility, of board function, we group them into, these are things where boards are doing reasonably well. This is a strength. Categories where we think that, solid performance, and then challenge areas. And you can see that several of the areas that are linked to knowledge of programs are actually challenge areas for a whole lot of boards. Community building and outreach, that's a place where executives are giving their boards a C+, board chairs a B. fundraising, C and C plus. And then overall, knowledge of programs is rated as a B and a B plus, showing some significant room for improvement, and also, high stakes in terms of doing so. So I want to share one more slide in terms of looking at the data and setting context before we talk a lot more about what does this actually mean, and more importantly, what do we do about it? So the next slide looks at board development priorities, and specifically, what are the 3 most important areas that the board should address to improve its own performance? And you can see here that we have responses from both executives and board chairs. Number 1, every time we do the study, fundraising, with 67% of executives and 64% of board chairs saying that this is one of the 3 most important areas to improve. Second, outreach and ambassadorship. And then I'm going to skip over the board leadership pipeline, but 4th is commitment and engagement, and 5th is strategic planning. So all of the areas that are linked really strongly to strong knowledge of organizational programs are areas that boards and executives themselves are saying we really want to focus on improving here. So when we think about, again, high leverage opportunities to really strengthen board performance across the board and really invest in strategies that are focused on the places that executives and chairs themselves are saying most improvement is needed, building up the board's knowledge of programs is, to me, clearly a huge opportunity and a place that's worthy of a lot of thought and investment of time. So with that, we're going to go ahead and advance to the next slide, and I want to turn it over to Vernetta just to share a little bit about what that actually means in real life with individual boards.
Thank you, Anne. So I was asked to think about some real case examples of how do you do this? How do you help boards connect to the work? And I think sometimes when we either share data or we're talking about what it means to be a high-performing board, sometimes we scare organizations. They're thinking, what do we really need to do to accomplish this? But I've seen a number of examples where boards have just taken some practical approaches to helping, or boards, I should say, chief executives and boards to an extent, to really helping the entire board understand what it would take to advance the mission, and that means connecting to the programs. So the first example that I want to share, and I'm not going to give the organization's name, but I'll tell you about them and how this particular executive director, it was like one day she just put on her thinking cap and said, we're going to do this. So the organization itself is one that works with children and families. They want to make sure that kids are prepared to start school and that they can develop and succeed in in a global community, essentially. That's how they describe it. And in doing their work, they're not only providing resources for child care or early care and education programs. They're also providing some wraparound services and supports for the families and tools to assist them in raising healthy, happy, successful children. Okay, so that's about the organization. And in working with this organization, I can recall my early engagement with them. When I would go into the board meeting, everyone would show up, and it was one of those meetings they'd have over lunch. And so they'd come in, get their lunch, sit down, and it was presentation after presentation after presentation from the staff. And you really didn't hear much from the board. And I had a number of discussions with the executive director about changing this dynamic, because the individuals on the board and the way they're structured, they have a lot of community representation, but also they have individuals who are educators, a couple of local elected officials, and individuals in the healthcare, in healthcare. So very well-rounded in terms of being able to think through how do we strengthen children and families to achieve the level of success, which would be their mission impact? And as we were talking about it and talking about engaging the board, when I came for the next meeting and I showed up, and the ED didn't even tell me about this ahead of time, there was a school bus in front of their meeting location. Now, the board members knew. She said, we're going on a trip. And what we did, and I got on the school bus too, we visited several of the programs that they fund. And it was classic right out of the book Governance is Leadership, where they talk about work at the boundaries, where as a group you have an opportunity to experience the mission in action. And as I'm observing the board members, at each location, it was as though a light bulb would go off or someone just kind of flipped a switch. And for the first time, they were starting to really understand why they were on the board. They had an opportunity to engage with whether it was a center director, a child care provider, asking about the curriculum that's being provided and understanding what was needed. Fast forward to the next couple of meetings, it's a whole different ball game. These board members are now asking questions. They understand the connections that they bring, but also they understand the types of questions they should be asking to help advance the mission. So when you ask, what does it take? How do we get board members to understand? I'm going to say one thing on my list, and it's only one, is connect to the program, do the work at the boundaries as a group so that they can actually see, feel, touch, understand, because there were definitely bright people on the board. They understood on paper what the organization is about, but for whatever reason, they hadn't made that personal connection in terms of this is what I'm here for. I want to give another example as well, and this one involves a community-based program that focuses on community development and also affordable housing. And in this instance, there was a chief executive who, along with the senior team, they had an annual calendar. They had a lot of really good governance practices in place. And one of the practices that they had was providing ongoing education for the board members. Now, when we talk about understanding programs, you might think, well, that's going to get you there, right? If we have staff really explain what we're doing, and there's always a presentation, and we have thoughtfully prepared this year-long agenda of how we're going to engage our board in learning. At least that's what they thought. And one day, one of the board members spoke up and said, I'm not sure I'm the right person to be on this board. And this was one of the community members. And she approached the chief executive and she said, I love this organization, but a lot of what you're talking about, I don't understand. What I do know is that this organization enabled me to stay in my house. You came in, you renovated, and as a senior citizen, I needed those improvements. But now as you're talking about the finances and other things that you're doing, I don't get it. That was a wake-up call for that chief executive, who for the next year said, okay, we're going to redo this. We need to rethink it. And instead of the staff planning, okay, we're going to train them on this, we're going to cover these topics, they worked with the board. And the board developed its own agenda. But the board didn't just develop an agenda for staff to present. Now the board had its own assignments. And that's very different because they were owning what they needed to learn and they were able to work with staff, but it was board members making presentations throughout the course of the year. Now, I want to tell you how this pays off and really addresses some of those other areas where you talked about ability to engage effectively in strategy, overall commitment engagement, fundraising, and external leadership. Fast forward past this year of the board owning its own education about the programs, engaging, and being able to really fully articulate what the organization does. This CEO told the story of how they had a significant increase in their community development block grant. So much so that other organizations started asking, what are you doing? Like, who are you getting to? Who are you reaching to have that much of an increase in your funding? And the CEO said, it wasn't me, it's my board members. Because now they're able to talk about the programs, they're talking to anyone who will listen in the community, and they became the best ambassadors, and they were able to also connect with the local decision makers and tell the story. So understanding the programs, thinking about how you can really make it come alive for the board members, whether it's the board members owning it, doing the work at the boundaries, or creating an environment where it's okay to say, you know what, we understand you're all passionate, but it's going to take a lot more than passion to advance the mission. It helps. The last point I want to make is really about connecting the dots between financial sustainability and programmatic sustainability. And I always think about the book, I wrote it down, Nonprofit Sustainability, Gene Bell, Jan Masaoka, and Steve Zimmerman. And in chapter 1, they said financial sustainability and programmatic sustainability cannot be separated. It's not enough to be financially stable. We build out organizations for impact. So in addition to the financial reports, board members really need to receive information that helps them understand the programs, including program evaluations, progress reports, and they need this information so that they can make sound strategic decisions about the organization. So connecting the dots in terms of the education, the understanding the finances or the financial side and the programmatic side of the organization, doing the work at the boundaries, these are easy ways to just open the door for deeper understanding, because ultimately what we're trying to do is cultivate a team. And what really binds a team is a shared sense of purpose. But you can't have that if folks don't understand what's going on. Those are my comments.
Thank you so much, Fernetta. And I love just this idea that, you know, it's not about telling board members what you want them to know. You can't tell understanding. It's about engaging the board so that they can really touch and feel the programs and then be able to share it with others, which is exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about, you know, external ambassadorship, fundraising, really cultivating that commitment to the organization. And I would argue that strategic work, because you can't really do that strategic work well if you're not invested in the long-term success of the organization in a really deep and substantive way. So let's go ahead and take a look at the next slide, because we want to just share a few thoughts about some things that you can do to really start cultivating this connection to program. And I think this really reinforces and echoes some of the stories that Fernetta was sharing. So first, think about varying the way that information about programmatic impact is shared. So, you know, dashboards are fantastic. We're huge believers in dashboards, but they don't always bring the stories of what that impact means to life. So thinking about linking data and programmatic dashboards with real stories about what that means for the people in the communities that you serve. Creating opportunities, and this, I love the bus, that's just the perfect image. Creating opportunities for board members to experience the programs in the first person. And obviously this is easier for some organizations than others, but thinking about, you know, if you can't go to the program or have them actually participate in the program, how do you bring in some guest speakers that can share with them in a way that is meaningful? And really incorporating those stories into board meetings. And again, I would say, you know, the goal of doing that is not just for board members to hear and understand those stories, but really for them to be able to absorb them and be moved by them in a way that enables them to share those stories with others. And, you know, it's great to go on a bus and take a tour, and that's a wonderful big thing to do. But I also would say, it doesn't have to be that big. You know, one of the most powerful things that a board can do in terms of connecting board members to program is to have what we call a mission moment at the beginning or in the middle of every single board meeting, so that you are taking that time to say, here's what our mission is all about, here's the difference that we're making in the world, and here's what it means to the people in the communities that we serve. So that there is always that focus on the reason that we are here. You should not get through an entire board meeting without some conversation about the reason that your organization exists and the reason that you do the work that you do. And that's really the opportunity that regular mission moments create. So I'm curious for Netta and Ruth, if you have other things that you would add to this list as suggestions for cultivating connection to programs.
Well, I want to go back to my original point, which is that rather than cultivating after the fact, I think it's wise to make sure that like prospective board members actually do understand the mission and programs of the organization, and that they basically can say them to you because it's that important. You're inviting somebody into your house, not just as a guest, but as a permanent resident who's going to tell you what to do.
Yeah.
So in that case, not having them understand the principles and values of the particular program that you're running is a very, very serious matter. That would be like that visitor really not understanding your culture at all and simply insisting that things be discussed in their own terms, and then kind of, feeling free to dismiss what is in the tradition of the organization. And that, that's not something anybody should be willing to sign up for. So, my urge to people is always take this on before you elect a board member. Make sure that they have an experience with the organization, that you give them chances for engagement before they ever walk into that boardroom, because that at least gives you a gauge about how much they can sustain a real interest in the organization as it exists. So that would be my.
Yeah, I love that.
I agree with that, but also, there are a number of boards that have designated seats on their board, so they don't always have a choice of cultivating that relationship ahead of time. So then you have to still think about, how do we create these opportunities so that, work at the boundaries, getting outside the boardroom as a group. In governance is leadership, they talk about the internal boundaries, the external boundaries, all of that is well and good. Love the mission stories or mission moments. I have seen a board that, and actually this was a funder, and this organization had been funding a program that was, it's a very liberal leaning organization, but they do a lot of work defending the Bill of Rights. And sometimes organizations, as you might imagine, some of these conversations become very charged because of the type of organization. But I also saw that same board essentially just kind of melt because they brought in a grantee who was able to talk about how important it was to have essentially their day in court, to have their rights, to have representation that they would not have had otherwise if it had not been for the funding to this organization. And what this particular, and when I say the grantees, not an organization, I'm talking real individuals whose lives were impacted and changed as a result. And when you see that up close and personal, you get it. You might be an appointee to that board, but it's humanizing the story. And not all stories will have, well, there's old people, children, babies, puppies. So whatever the mission is, how do you bring it to life? I'll give one other example, though. That was an opportunity for a board to dig in a little deeper. And this was a board that certainly thought they understood the work of this organization. And they showed up for the board meeting, And the CEO had up on a huge wall, like posters with all of their programs. And each board member, she gave them each Post-it and asked the board members to identify the funding for each of those programs. And it was limited. It could be, what percentage is government, what percentage is contributed revenue, what percentage is earned revenue. They were so far off in just about every instance that was a nice and gentle way of opening the door to say, okay, we're going to do some work here because, as much as we talk about it, you get reports, you get dashboards, something's not connecting. Something's not connecting. So I think it's helpful to just take a step back and figure out, how do we share? How do we engage? I'm a person, I need to see, touch, and experience. You can give me a bunch of stuff on paper. You can give me all kinds of notebooks or spreadsheets. I need to see, touch, feel, and experience. And with that, I'm definitely more engaged. One more story for you, and this isn't a story, but it was something that just made sense to me. I watched one of our consultants doing a training one day, and she had set up the room before everyone came in there. She put a bunch of Coke products on the table. So you have Coca-Cola, they make all kinds of juices and a few other products. They were all in the center of the tables, and there were several tables. And she said, take whatever you want, And of course, folks started grabbing for the products, whatever was their favorite. And she says, I knew there were enough products that there's something for everyone. You'll find something you like. You might be very passionate about it. And folks they were negotiating to get their favorite product with the other folks at the table. She says, now everyone has something. You ended up with what you are most passionate about. But just because you're passionate about that product doesn't mean you are qualified to sit on the board of Coke. And they thought about it. And it was like, yeah, you're right. And sometimes we take that shortcut in the nonprofit sector. We think someone's passionate about us, and we're going to turn that into something else. But we need passion plus. And that's what we have to remember. The passion alone is not enough. And Ruth, you were talking about what are the other skill sets, qualifications, exposure, essentially shared buy-in in terms of what we're trying to do, and the ability to help us with that end result that has to be mission impact.
Right.
Okay, I'll stop talking.
I think that's excellent. It's just excellent advice. It is, we build these bodies as integrated teams. We want something to hold them together. And the holding of them together is the vision and mission of the organization. All the rest flows into that. And so the buy-in is incredibly important. The understanding of what are the variables. What kind of money do we want to accept? What kind of money don't we want to accept? What are the trade-offs of taking this versus that kind of money? All of those practical considerations are part of a larger conversation that has to do with values and principles of the organization. And it's amazing how quickly that can unravel on boards. And that's where you end up seeing these absolutely, people getting really furious with one another for not understanding a basic point of practice on their boards, because essentially there isn't that common understanding of what's important here, what feeds into the program, what detracts from it, all of that.
Yeah, and just to add something there, Ruth, I don't have a slide on it, but for those of you that are interested in learning more, there are some findings in Leading with Intent that speak to that very point. The first is, fortunately, the vast majority of nonprofit boards do say that their board does really well in terms of its commitment to the mission. And they also say that that is the primary or is the most common criteria for recruiting new board members, is understanding and passion for the mission. But to go a little bit deeper, there is a relationship between the understanding or commitment to the mission and the extent to which the board uses values-driven decision-making. And it's particularly striking in the negative. So for those boards that are not well rated in terms of their passion for and commitment to the mission, they are much more likely to not report that they have values-driven decision-making in the way that their board operates. And so it's just driving home that point with data.
Yeah. Okay, so there are a whole bunch of questions here, and
Great.
Vernetta, you made a good point somewhere in here, because there's a bunch of people who are saying, go Vernetta.
And we can advance to the next slide just to move to questions.
Okay, so the first question is, this understanding of program, was that, is that the only such powerful coordinate that you could find in the findings? So you correlated that to a number of different desirable behaviors on the parts of boards. Was that the most marked correlation that you could find in the research?
It was not necessarily the strongest relationship between any two or any set of board characteristics, but it was the strongest relationship when we were looking at strategy, fundraising, and community building. It was the one that was the most strongly related there, and we looked at that more closely because those were areas where boards and executives were saying that they really didn't feel that they were doing as well, and where they really wanted to improve. So we were looking to the data to guide us in terms of, you know, where should investments be made if boards are looking to really strengthen their performance there, and that's where it really came to the fore.
Right. Okay, and then another question is, well, are we really supposed to involve the board that much in understanding the program? Can't we just delegate it to a program committee?
Well, do you want to delegate all of those other things to the program committee? Right. I mean, I think that's the thing is, you know, if understanding of programs is what it takes for the board to really be engaged and committed and doing strategy work and willing to engage in the external community, then I think that's pretty important for the full board.
Yeah, and I guess maybe there's a question within the question of what is that much? Because again, as a body, so the board governs as a body, and the board, as that governing body, quite often has to make difficult decisions. And those decisions may involve, it might be eliminating programs, it might be starting new programs, it might be thinking differently about how you carry out your mission. And if you don't have some threshold, and that's what can change. So when I say there's a question within the question, what do you mean by that much? There may be a program committee that is much more deeply engaged. They might do site visits. They may work with a staff member, but still the entire board needs to have a threshold level of understanding so that they can make informed decisions about what's going on in the organization, so that they can make informed decisions about what's next.
Okay, and just a kind of a clarification question. What exactly do you mean by ambassadorship?
So we use ambassadorship as a broad term to talk about external engagement in community. So representation of the organization externally, and also engaging folks in the organization. So that, you know, at its broadest definition, it would be inclusive of fundraising. But when we talk about it alongside of fundraising, we're typically talking about community engagement and advocacy.
Okay, and then I've got kind of two questions that go together. One of them is, how would you apply this understanding, what your research, the findings from your research, to a newly formed board? And then there's another question from somebody else saying, what do we do if it's hard to engage our board on anything because they're very long-term board members and just kind of sitting in the room?
That last one is a much bigger question, and you know that. If there are board members who aren't engaged in anything, then yeah, we could pick that apart, unpeel that onion layer by layer. But in terms, I'm sorry, I started talking. Repeat. What was the first part of the question?
How would you apply this to a newly formed organization? Like if you were to construct a board from scratch, you know, how would you apply this particular finding?
I think it's something, this is the way I think of startup organizations. Even if it's a new organization, you want to start with some sound principles. So that same buy-in that's necessary in terms of what you want to accomplish and getting, or I should say shared vision of what you're trying to accomplish is important. You might be just starting your programs, but understanding what that's going to look like. And just because it's a startup doesn't mean that there's no work to do. Even coming into a new space, you have to understand the environment in which you're operating. So if there's someone offering something similar, you need to understand that to see how you're different. If there's no one in that space, then you still need to understand how you can do it most effectively. Because if you're doing something and it's not about, and there isn't that commitment to doing it in a way that's going to add value and benefit, then why are you doing it? So even as a startup, again, understanding, getting off, starting off on the right foot. Startup, when I think about life cycles, yeah, there's certain policies that we know that the board is going to be much more hands-on. They might not have all the policies in place, but this understanding about the work of the organization, that has to, it's not a given, but it has to be a part of it.
Yeah, and just
doing it.
Sorry. I was just going to jump in there. I think often actually startup organizations have a bit of a leg up because usually, the founding board is extremely connected to the mission, the vision, and the programs of an organization. And the development curve there, or the learning curve there is, how do we shift from being a truly operational board to being more of a governing board? And I think the secret sauce here is how do you make that shift to a governing board without losing the soul that comes with that intimate understanding and commitment to programs. So I think this is a place actually where startup organizations might be better off.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that happens over time, and this is true about organizations in general, is that as they grow and develop, they react to themselves. So if an organization, kind of starts out with passion, not so many systems to support the passion and the growth, then at some point they may say, enough with the passion, we need the systems. And then everything kind of, overcorrects to the other side. And I think the trick is for good managers is to really make sure that you do not allow that to happen, that the bureaucratization of boards can actually be a fairly big problem in the effectiveness of your organization, if these results are true, which I believe they are.
Yeah, I could not agree more. And I think that goes back to your earlier point, Ruth, about the importance of, recruiting folks for their commitment to the organization's mission and vision and their engagement and understanding of programs. I think we actually, do my perception is we do a decent job of that, but we sometimes beat it out of folks, through the service. And it's sort of, that's the reason they've come to the board, but they don't get to experience that by serving on the board. And that's a real shame. And so that's where those, building into the culture of the board, those opportunities to connect or reconnect with the organization's work are so important.
Right.
And then continuing to think about how you engage them, because as you were just talking, it just, the question comes up in my mind. We hear it all the time. Is it a problem of performance or a problem of purpose? As we're trying to analyze. And as I was thinking about the board that you mentioned, Ruth, who just isn't engaged in anything. So that's one that needs to be unpacked, but definitely it's worth unpacking because you don't want to continue to move forward that way.
Right. There's a question in here, and the question itself is very revealing. And I'd just like you guys to maybe address it a little bit, which is some executives worry that the board will get too involved in program if they are too exposed to it.
I think that's it's a valid concern. I mean, micromanaging boards it's a real issue, and it's very tough for that partnership to work the way that it's supposed to if the board is over engaging in places that it shouldn't be. And I think that very honestly that goes back to the first finding that I shared from Leading with Intent about the importance of the board really understanding its role. And there is so much that relies on that understanding, because without that, engagement itself, no matter what kind of engagement, can be a risk. So making sure that the board really understands what is its role in program, that it understands that, it's there to understand the way that the organization works enough to be able to make good decisions about it and really, guide strategy, that it's there to make sure that there is quality in terms of the work that the organization is doing, that the organization is resourced in a way that enables it to do that, not to get in there and figure it all out themselves. So I think you got to start from that understanding of what is the board's job versus the staff's job, and then engagement should be a value add.
I agree.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say I agree wholeheartedly with what you just said, and I always say framing is very important because there's some things that you want to expose the board to, just for their just to really illuminate. We're not asking for decisions on this. We're exposing. Sometimes you're sharing for all of the reasons that you said. And I remember something you told me once, and as I don't know how I had raised this question, but you talked about the importance of creating space for the board to be the board. And sometimes that's going to feel a little scary when you're sharing something, not quite sure how they will dig in, where they will dig in, but also having a partner on the front end to help with that framing in terms of, what type of conversation we're trying to have or why we're sharing this information. But being afraid of the board micromanaging, just go back and figure out, think through what is it that you want to get out of any conversation? What is it that the board needs to be able to do its job? And how are you going to strike a balance so that you can create the space for the board to be the board, and negate or offset, any micromanaging that might come because of how you've teed up the issues. If you direct them in the wrong way, then you're going to get a different result. But you can create this space.
Mm-hmm. And I think that micromanaging, that attempt to over control, actually can go both ways. And if you're nervous as heck about the board having too much information to make responsible decisions at the helm of your organization, you have a big problem. This is, you have the wrong board based on the wrong precepts, and you just need to change things up. And this is why I think it's just so incredibly important that we really think about, does this board know what's important in the program, know why we do this rather than that, why we've chosen this model rather than that model to provide shelter for individual homeless people. All of that, those values precepts are so critically important. And then there's so much else to know on top of that. Why one kind of funding mutilates a program, versus making it work better, that kind of thing. But I think that in general, it's if you feel, I love the way that you put it, when you talked about making the role of the board kind of primary. If you're clear on the role of the board and you have common clarity on that, you don't need to control their behavior necessarily. Like, other people will call them if they overstep their bounds. And so it's, there's, if you're nervously trying to control the boundaries of your board, you have some larger problems in there that you probably need to work on. Do you guys have anything? Sorry, I didn't mean to go on so long, but did you guys have anything else that you want to add before we end?
I would just say thanks to everyone for their engagement in this conversation. These were great questions and a great way to close out the session. And thanks to you, Ruth, for hosting us once again.
Oh, it was so much fun, as always. Renetta?
And don't be afraid of your board. Engage them. A board, I forgot the saying, but I know it used to end with, a board can be, a board is a gift, not a victory, but a gift. So I'm screwing it up, but do think of it. Think of the asset that you have at hand and how you can really put that great asset to work for the benefit of the mission, the organization, and for the chief executive to help you.
Right. Thank you so much, Renetta and Anne, and everybody who attended. Don't forget to come back on December 12th and probably well beyond that, because we've got some big plans together for the coming year.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, and we will see you soon. Bye.